One tulip bulb, sold for roughly the price of a fine house on an Amsterdam canal, still in the ground, unbloomed, seen by no one. And the famous story of what happened next turns out to be mostly wrong. Buried Ledger. Episode 2, The Flower That Outpriced a House. In the winter of 1636, in the Dutch Republic, a single tulip bulb of a rare, flame-streaked variety called Semper Augustus changed hands for roughly the price of a fine house on an Amsterdam canal. Nobody involved had seen it bloom. It was still in the ground, dormant, a promise wrapped in dirt. What they were actually buying and selling was a piece of paper. This is the story of tulip mania, the bubble everyone reaches for first when they want an example of one, the oldest name in the genre. It shows up in economist Charles Kindleberger's classic survey, Manias, Panics, and Crashes, first published in 1978 and still updated today with new chapters on .com stocks and, more recently, cryptocurrency, always tracing the same rough shape back to the same starting point in the Dutch Republic. And it turns out to be a stranger story than the one most people know, because a large part of what made tulip mania famous isn't quite what happened. The tulip arrived in the Dutch Republic in the late 1500s, imported from the Ottoman Empire, and it caught on fast in a country that had just become rich from global trade and was hungry for new ways to show it. Some bulbs, infected with what growers didn't understand was a virus, produced flowers with wild, unrepeatable streaks and flames of color, the broken tulips. They couldn't be reliably bred to order. Each one was a one-time event. That unpredictability made the finest breeds, like Semper Augustus, genuinely rare, and rarity among wealthy Dutch merchants did what it always does. Nobody in the 1630s knew why the breaking happened, and that mystery sat unsolved for 3 centuries. It wasn't until 1928 that a British mycologist named Dorothy Cayley finally proved the cause was a virus, spread bulb to bulb by aphids feeding on the plant sap, a disease now known as tulip-breaking virus. The very thing that made a bulb valuable, in other words, was a sick bulb, weakened generation over generation by the same infection that painted it. Growers in the 1630s had no name for any of this. They only knew that a broken bulb was rare, that rare bulbs threw broken offshoots unpredictably, and that predicting which plain bulb might someday break into something extraordinary was as close to a lottery ticket as farming got. The Semper Augustus itself has a stranger history than the price tag suggests. For years in the 1620s, the entire known stock of the variety belonged to a single Amsterdam merchant, who understood exactly what he had and refused to sell the bulb itself at any price, offering only its rare offshoots, and even those under contracts that barred the buyer from reselling either the flower or its future bulbs without his permission. A single Semper Augustus bulb, worth around 1,000 guilders in 1623, had climbed to 3,000 guilders within 2 years on nothing more than that scarcity and that owner's refusal to let go of control. By the peak of the market in 1637, asking prices for the variety were reported as high as 10,000 guilders, against the roughly 300 guilders a skilled craftsman earned in a year, and against the 150 guilders that had been closer to an average yearly income a decade earlier. Put another way, one bulb of one flower was, by the winter of 1636 and 1637, worth more than 30 years of a craftsman's labor, and the man who controlled the supply of it had built that value entirely by refusing, patiently, for over a decade, to let anyone else grow it freely. It wasn't only Semper Augustus. A whole tier of prized varieties moved through similarly staggering numbers in that same short window. A single Viceroy bulb, according to one contemporary catalogue, was priced at anywhere from 3,000 to 4,150 guilders. An Admiral van der Eyck, a variety with what growers described as exceptionally strong, straight blood-red stripes, sold for 1,045 guilders at one recorded auction and was valued as high as 4,000 guilders elsewhere in the same season. Even the far more common Switzer variety, nowhere near the rarity of a broken Semper Augustus, still climbed from 125 guilders to 1,500 guilders in barely 5 weeks, between the very end of December 1636 and the 3rd of February, 1637, the exact day, as it turned out, that the whole thing stopped. None of this happened in a vacuum. The Dutch Republic in the 1630s was in the middle of what historians now call its golden age, flush with profits pouring in from the Dutch East India Company's global trade monopoly, its merchant fleet the largest in the world, its cities newly, conspicuously rich. Tulip speculation wasn't some bizarre aberration in an otherwise sober economy, it was one more expression of a culture that had, in living memory, watched ordinary trade turn ordinary merchants into extraordinarily wealthy men, and had every reason to believe the next unlikely commodity might do it again. By late 1636, trading had moved well past actual flowers. Bulbs stay dormant in the ground for most of the year, so traders began buying and selling futures contracts, promises to deliver a bulb after the next harvest, in taverns, through informal trading groups that historians later nicknamed the wind trade, because no money and no flowers actually changed hands at the table, only paper. These groups organized themselves into what the Dutch called colleges, each with its own bidding rituals, its own small transaction fee nicknamed wine money, and its own rough code of honor for settling disputes, since a promise to deliver a bulb that didn't yet legally exist wasn't the kind of contract any court was eager to enforce. A buyer could put down a small deposit and control a contract worth many times his own income. Ordinary tulip varieties, not just the rare ones, started climbing fast in the first weeks of 1637, some rising more than tenfold in a matter of weeks. The bulbs themselves were priced in a way that only made the speculation stranger. Because a bulb still in the ground couldn't be inspected for its bloom, buyers and sellers instead priced it by weight. In a small unit called the AAS, a heavier bulb was assumed to be capable of throwing off more offshoot bulblets down the line, and therefore worth proportionally more, whether or not it ever actually did. Some contracts for the most sought-after varieties changed hands as many as 10 times in a single day, each new buyer paying more than the last for a promise resting on a promise, with nobody at any point in the chain having actually seen the flower the contract described. This is the part where the popular version of the story insists the whole country lost its mind: nobles, maids, chimney sweeps, everyone trading bulbs, fortunes made and lost by washerwomen. It's a vivid image, and it's mostly not true. Historian and Goldgar spent years going through the actual surviving contracts and court records from the period for her 2007 book on the subject, and found something much smaller, roughly 350 people who can be documented trading in tulips at the speculative peak, nearly all of them wealthy merchants and skilled craftsmen who were already comfortably established, not the poor, and not the aristocracy either. It was a real, contained, upper-middle-class speculative frenzy, not a national delusion. Most of the trading, notarized or otherwise, was concentrated in a handful of towns: Haarlem, Amsterdam, Alkmaar, Leiden, among people who already knew each other from church, from trade guilds, from the same tight circles of Dutch civic life. One especially strange detail belongs to the very peak of the market. A tavern keeper in the town of Alkmaar named Wouter Barthelmeus Winkel had, almost by accident, become one of the richest men in town by speculating in tulip bulbs on the side. When he died, his guardians arranged to auction his bulb collection for the benefit of his orphan children, and the sale was scheduled for the 5th of February, 1637, 99 lots, sold to the highest bidder, a printed one-page broadsheet later listing every price. The auction brought in roughly 90,000 guilders, a fortune, for a dead innkeeper's flower collection. A pamphlet printed within days listed every one of the 99 lots and the price each one fetched, which is part of why historians can still reconstruct the sale in such detail nearly 4 centuries later. It also happened to land just 2 days after the market had already begun to break in Haarlem, meaning the orphans of Wouter Winkel very nearly caught, by pure chance of timing, the very last moment the market was still willing to pay those numbers. A sale a week later, historians generally agree, would have raised a small fraction of that total. Because the collapse came fast, as these things do. On the 3rd of February, 1637, at a routine bulb auction in Haarlem, buyers simply stopped bidding. Historians still argue over exactly why that particular day was the one. Some point to a glut of ordinary bulbs flooding the market, some to simple exhaustion of new buyers willing to pay ever higher prices, and some to the fact that Haarlem, that same winter, was in the grip of a bubonic plague outbreak that was killing residents, including tulip growers, by the week, adding a very literal urgency to why people might suddenly want cash in hand rather than a contract for a flower 6 months away. Whatever the trigger, word spread within days. Prices that had climbed for weeks fell by more than 90% almost as quickly as they'd risen. In some cases, buyers who'd committed to contracts found the bulbs behind them worth less than 5%, in a few reported cases closer to 1%, of what they'd agreed to pay only days earlier. Thousands of futures contracts signed in tavern back rooms suddenly weren't worth honoring, and there was no formal exchange, no clearinghouse, no regulator to sort out who owed what to whom. The dispute went all the way to Dutch courts and town councils, which spent months wrangling over what a wind trade contract was even legally worth, and eventually ruled that contract holders could settle for a small fraction of the agreed price, around 10%, rather than the full amount, an early, informal version of what modern markets would later formalize as a bankruptcy settlement. It wasn't a clean resolution. It was closer to a shrug written into law. Everyone agrees this got out of hand, so everyone eats part of the loss and the courts move on. Even that took months to arrive at. Local town councils petitioned the states of Holland, the provincial government, to step in and settle the wave of disputes almost as soon as the crash began, but the provincial court's first instinct was simply to tell buyers and sellers to work it out among themselves. It wasn't until the 27th of April, 1637, nearly 3 months after the Haarlem auction that started the unraveling, that the States General finally issued a formal resolution addressing the futures contracts directly, and even then the guidance amounted to permission for a cancellation fee rather than a binding, uniform settlement. Growers, who had planted and tended bulbs on the strength of contracts nobody now wanted to honor, absorbed a disproportionate share of the damage. They had no equivalent, further downstream, to pass the loss on to. Here's the buried part. 200 years after the fact, in 1841, a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay wrote a book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, and gave the world its enduring picture of tulip mania, mass ruin, aristocrats reduced to poverty, an economy brought to its knees by a flower. Mackay was writing colorful moral history, not doing archival research, and he leaned heavily on satirical pamphlets from the 1630s that Dutch moralists had written to mock speculation, not to record it accurately. One of those pamphlets contained a now famous list of goods supposedly traded for a single viceroy tulip bulb, wagonloads of wheat and rye, fat oxen, fat sheep, wine, cheese, a silver drinking cup, a suit of clothes, that Mackay presented as a real transaction. Later researchers who tracked down the original pamphlet found it wasn't a record of an actual trade at all. It was a satirical illustration meant to show readers, in relatable terms, roughly what a certain sum of guilders was worth, the way a modern writer might say a price equals a used car and a semester of college tuition. It was never a receipt. Mackay printed it as one anyway. One specific myth is worth dismantling on its own, because it's repeated constantly and it's simply wrong. The Dutch painter Jan van Goyen is frequently cited as a man personally ruined by tulip mania, dying deep in debt because of flowers. Van Goyen did die owing roughly 18,000 guilders. But when historians traced where that debt actually came from, the overwhelming majority of it turned out to be land speculation and other real estate dealings that had nothing to do with tulips at all. Tulips were a minor, almost incidental part of his finances. The story stuck to him anyway, because the painter ruined by tulip mania was too tidy a detail for later writers to check. When Goldgar went looking for the bankruptcies Mackay described, she couldn't find a single documented case of someone actually ruined by the tulip crash, no bankruptcy filings, no court records of families put out on the street, nothing matching the scale of devastation the popular story insists on. The people trading at the top of the market were wealthy enough that even a bad loss, absorbed through the court's 10% settlements, didn't break them. It caused no real effect on the economy whatsoever, is how she put it, after years of digging through the ledgers Mackay never opened. The Dutch Golden Age, as an economic era, simply continued afterward largely undisturbed, no recession traceable to tulip prices, no wave of failed businesses, nothing in the broader Dutch economy that historians can point to and say, this is the damage the flowers did. What Goldgar did find, combing through the court records, wasn't financial ruin so much as social wreckage on a smaller, quieter scale, buyers who had promised 100 or 1,000 guilders for a bulb and then simply refused to pay once the price collapsed, neighbors and fellow church members suing each other, reputations damaged in towns small enough that everyone knew exactly who had welched on a tulip contract. Her book's subtitle calls it a study of money, honor, and knowledge, and it's the honor part that turns out to have taken the real hit, not fortunes, but standing in a community where your word was supposed to be worth exactly what you'd promised. The numbers back up just how contained the legal fallout actually was. Out of many thousands of notarial contracts drawn up across the Dutch Republic in 1637, Goldgar could identify only around 37 individuals who ended up in tulip-related lawsuits. Haarlem's Small Claims Court, which normally met twice a week to handle routine local disputes, did see a real spike of tulip cases that autumn, but even there, the complaint was almost never about money changing hands improperly. It was about delivery, a seller who'd promised a bulb at one price, watched the market run past it, and simply refused to hand the bulb over at the price he'd already agreed to. So the real story isn't that tulip mania was uniquely irrational. It's that the version everyone knows was written by someone who never checked the receipts, and it was a better story than the truth, so it survived for 2 centuries while the actual, more modest ledger sat quietly in Dutch archives waiting for someone to read it. What actually happened was a sharp, contained, real speculative bubble among a few hundred well-off Dutch merchants, trading a genuinely strange and beautiful natural mystery they didn't understand, in a market with no rules built for it yet, serious enough to produce real winners and real losers, small enough to leave the country's prosperity almost entirely untouched. Every bubble since has been compared to tulip mania. Financial writers reach for it constantly. It turned up in serious arguments about dot-com stocks in the late 1990s, and again in arguments about cryptocurrency in the 2010s and 2020s, always as shorthand for pure, groundless, mass hysteria. Almost none of those writers, understandably, went back to the original Dutch court records before making the comparison. Most of that comparison rests on a story that was never fully accurate to begin with, embroidered 2 centuries later by a writer who liked his satire better than his sources, a case of one buried ledger being used, ever since, to explain every other one. That's the story for this week. I'm back with the next one soon. This has been Buried Ledger.